Welcome to this first edition of AI for Biology. I'm going to start by switching to the presentation, otherwise I cannot change the slide. So in this first hour, I'm going to give just a brief overview of the course, how it's structured, and how we're going to do the evaluation, the assessment. And then I'm going to talk about artificial intelligence in general and the origin of artificial neural networks, because this first part of the course will be focused on deep learning with artificial neural networks. I'm going to talk a bit about machine learning, basically review some of the things we talked about last semester, but then focus on this ability of neural networks to perform chains of nonlinear transformations in order to help us solve some particular problem. And I'm going to try to convince you that deep learning is a useful approach for many kinds of problems. So let's start with the outline of the course. The objective here is to give you a brief overview of two important and very distinct fields in artificial intelligence. So the first part of the course, these first 3 weeks, will be on deep learning, and we are dealing with problems at the sub-symbolic level. We are basically training large sets of parameters, models with lots of parameters, very quantitative, and then we obtain in those parameters some representations, useful representations of the data. And we talk about this as being sub-symbolic, something that is not quite explicit and symbolic. And the second half of the semester will be about explicit reasoning, logic, and mostly ontologies, which are ways of formalizing explicit knowledge that we have in a way that not only is helpful for humans to understand the knowledge, but also for computers to automatically process them. This will be a practical introduction with some theory, but also aimed at trying in these 6 weeks to get you to be able to do something practical with these approaches. So basically, we are going to see in this first part how to build and train deep neural networks. We're going to apply this to semi-realistic problems, so basically things dealing with images and so on, which are very useful in biology, because there's a lot of applications of deep learning to medical imaging. There are other applications like protein folding and so on, but those are really beyond the computational capacities of the average laptop. These will not be very realistic because we're going to use simple data sets, not real images. But they are realistic in the sense that if you have a better computer and you use, for example, CAT scans or NMR imaging, something like that, then you can apply the same techniques. You just need to train for a longer time and have more memory, more computing power. And in the second part, in ontologies, you're going to understand these formulas, the theory behind it, and how to do inference with biological knowledge. For example, gene ontology is a very important ontology in biology that basically organizes molecular functions, genes, and the proteins they express, and all the annotations of all those elements. So this is structured not only for humans to have a common vocabulary and concepts, but also so that the computer can make inferences automatically about those elements. I'm going to teach the first part on deep learning, these first 3 weeks. Professor Matthias Knorr will teach the second part on logic and ontologies. And your assessment will consist of 2 short assignments. The first one you should hand in by the end of this month, so before you start the second part. But it will be mostly a continuation of the exercises. So if you do all the exercises, then the assignment should be easy to finish. And then at the end of this half semester, on the 2nd of May, you will have the test, which will cover both parts here. You can replace the test with an exam at the end of the semester, and on the 9th of May you start the second course that takes this slot. So we're going to finish everything 1 week before, so then you can start the other one. So that's the plan. I hope it goes according to the plan. The main source of information for this course, at least for this first part, you can find on the course site, and I'm going to follow the same approach as the last semester. You'll have the slides. I'm recording the lecture. If everything goes well, you'll have the lecture there too. And you have a PDF file with the summaries of the subject and the exercises. I'm going to keep updating that PDF file because I'm still writing it. And this should give you what you need to know to pass the course, basically. So the level of detail is about that level. These additional references, I'm going to refer to them occasionally, especially this first one for deep learning, and they may be useful if you want to, if you have some issues and not understand well some things, go into a textbook and go a bit deeper. So you don't need to know at that level of detail, but it can help you understand things and have a clear idea. Because at least for my tasks, as you know, I always ask you to explain things, and the clearer you have the concepts in mind, the easier it is to answer and to have a good grade. Okay, so that part is important. So I recommend that you take some time to look at concepts that are not very clearly and go a bit deeper with these specs. We're going to use Python 3 as we used before. So I think you already used Anaconda before, right? And it's easy to install TensorFlow there. If you have an NVIDIA graphics card and want a bit more performance, you can install the GPU version of TensorFlow, but you need the CUDA libraries and the updated version of your drivers and so on. For this course, that's not necessary. We are not going to do anything that is intensive, so you can just install the CPU version. And also, it only works if you have NVIDIA cards. Alternatively, you can use Google Colab. So if you see that your laptop is not keeping up with the exercises, Google Colab is free. You can just log in with your Gmail account, and you can use it for a few hours every day for free. If you want to do this, I can tell you how to connect Google Colab to your Google Drive so that you can upload and download files and use the files there. But probably it's easier if you just do locally, because since you've already been working with Anaconda and Spider and so on, this would be simpler. Okay, so that's the bureaucratic part. Let's start with the subject matter. Artificial intelligence, the idea of having machines that think, was an old idea in fiction, but we can trace the start of the scientific modern artificial intelligence to 1956, where we have this summer project. Basically, the decision by these scientists was to try to bring together the best minds on computation and logic and so on, and in a few weeks solve this problem of putting the machine, the computer, to think as a human. So they expected this would not be a very difficult thing because the computer can do a lot of computations. It actually was a bit more difficult than what they thought, but they had this initial approach to AI, which is basically trying to put the computer to do this explicit reasoning that humans can write out when you write an argument or some kind of reasoning. So these were explicit rules, expert systems to help reason about something, and basically following these rules of inference. So, for example, in 1975, there was this Mycene expert system, which had a model of reasoning, but also included probabilities, and it was aimed at trying to diagnose or identify some bacterial strains. So, for example, if it's gram-positive and it's a coccus and it grows in chains, then there is a 70% probability that it's streptococcus. And it stored different rules, different connections between the different features, and produced an output based on the amount of evidence for each alternative. So these were the kind of rule-based expert systems that had the initial success in AI. But in parallel, we also had the idea of trying to model neural systems using mathematics. So basically, in 1943, this was the first mathematical model of the neuron, which we still use. And we know that a neuron works by receiving inputs in these dendrites, and then if the stimulus passes some threshold, the depolarization on the membrane will propagate by the axon and lead to the release of neurotransmitters here at the synaptic terminals. And this is not a linear response, so you don't have an output of the neuron proportional to the input. If the input is small, then the neuron doesn't do anything. But if it's large enough, even slightly above the threshold, then the action potential fires and you have an output there on the synapses. So this is a non-linear reaction to some stimulus, and it depends on all these dendrites and some threshold after which the neuron fires. So the model, McCullough and Pitt's mathematical model of the neuron is a weighted sum of the inputs. We can imagine that the stimuli reaching the dendrites are the values here in this vector, and each dendrite can have a different sensitivity to the stimulus. So this is modeled by the weights. Some of them respond strongly, some of them respond weakly, or even some of them may inhibit the activation of the neuron, so they can have a negative weight. And if we multiply each input by its corresponding weight and sum it, we can check if this passes the threshold for activating the neuron. And if it does, then we have an output here, so we have some nonlinear function here that outputs the firing of the neuron. And this was implemented by Rosenblatt in the perceptron, which is basically one neuron like this. But the question is, how can we find the ways to solve a particular problem? And this was what Rosenblatt found with this intelligent machine that was thought in 1958 to be the embryo of something that would be able to walk, reproduce, talk, and so forth. And the idea is basically this. We have the weighted sum of the inputs, some bias value just to adjust where the threshold will be, and if this is greater than 0, the neuron fires 1. If it's smaller than 0, the neuron does not fire. So by adjusting these weights here, we can calibrate the response to have the neuron distinguish between different inputs. One example, they created a camera of 20 by 20 pixels. They input the values that the camera was reading of the image and trained the neuron to distinguish different simple shapes here. And the trick is, how can we train the neuron? How can we find the ways? And this was the training rule that allowed the perceptron to learn, which is, if the output of the neuron, this O, is not the same as the target, so we want a 0 and the output is 1, or vice versa, then we multiply the difference here by a small value, so that we give small steps at each time, and we multiply it by the value of the input. And this is how much we have to change the corresponding weight. So if it's overshooting, if it's giving a higher response, we lower the weight multiplied by the input. Of course, if the input is negative, then the sign switches and so on. But if it's the other way around, we increase the weight. And this way, by giving examples, every time the perceptor makes a mistake, we make this adjustment. And eventually, it starts making fewer and fewer mistakes and learns what we want it to do. So this was a very revolutionary thing, because we don't need to know what we want. We don't need to have an explicit idea how to distinguish the shapes. We just present examples, we keep adjusting the weights, and eventually it understands what we want and does what we want. So this was a very promising thing. It was first implemented on an IBM 704, so it was implemented in software, but then it was actually built with this camera, 20 by 20 pixels, these wires connected all the pixels of the camera to potentiometers, and they had little electric motors that adjusted the potentiometer, so these were actually the weights there. And the whole thing, the perceptron built like this, actually learned automatically because it was adjusting the weights of all of those parts of the circuit. So the problem with this is that this is just a linear model. What we have here is a linear combination of the inputs, a weighted sum, and then we have a threshold function. We saw last semester logistic regression. It's basically this idea. And this is a linear model because you can only use linear combinations of the inputs, so you cannot separate things with curves, at least with the original data that we have. And this was a bit of a disappointment because, after all, this thing that would be intelligent talk and so forth is just a logistic regression, a linear classifier. And if you have something that is not linearly separable, then eventually it will try to find the best way of separating the data, but it will not work very well. So this was a big disappointment because this is actually, after all, if you use a sigmoid activation function and this logistic loss to train the neuron, then the neuron is effectively the same as the logistic regression. It's just the way of finding the parameters that is different. This was a very large disappointment and led to this AI winter. On the one hand, the logical systems were very limited because we need to put in all the information that we want, and then the system would do some trivial inferences. They could work for some things like proving simple theorems or things like that, but they were not really general intelligence that can solve generic problems. And this perceptron, the idea that you can just give examples and the machine understands what to do with them, turned out to be just a simple linear classifier, which was something that was already known from statistics and mathematics, so it was nothing new there. Now, one thing that was found is that, in theory, if we could create a network of neurons instead of just one neuron, then we could go far beyond this simple classifier. But the problem was how to find the equivalent of this update rule for a network of neurons. Because with one neuron, we can just adjust the weights in this way. If we stack neurons, then we don't know how to adjust the weights of the last one because it depends on the first one and vice versa. But during the 70s, there was this, the equivalent of the backpropagation algorithm. I'm going to talk a bit about that in a few minutes. It appeared in other contexts, and in 1986, it was proven that it could be used to train networks of neurons instead of just a single neuron. So here, things pick up again a bit, not only on neural networks, but in machine learning in general, because of some ideas that were appearing. Basically, we can see of artificial intelligence as having that part of logic and expert systems with explicit reasoning, and also machine learning, which is the attempt to give the computers this ability to learn, to improve at some task. And this is the more well-known definition by Mitchell in '97, that if we have a way to measure performance in some task, and the system is improving that performance as we give it more experience, more examples, then we can say that the system is learning. So this is the general idea of machine learning: have something that will improve as we give it examples. We don't need to explicitly program it to do something. We just show it what's wrong and what's right, and it starts getting a better performance. So basically, we need this task to perform, a measure of the performance, and then data to give the examples. We saw this last semester. This is just a brief review. And we have different kinds of machine learning problems that we can think about. Although when we can use deep neural networks for all of these, and deep down they look pretty much the same, but from our perspective there are some differences. One is that we can go from the the feature values, the learner is just giving us new representations of the data. So this would be unsupervised learning. We are not really measuring if it's getting things right or wrong. We just want to have another representation of the data. For example, with principal component analysis, you can reduce data in very high dimensions to lower dimensions, preserving the variance. And you're getting a new representation of the data by doing that. With clustering, you can assign to each example the membership to a group, and this basically tells you these examples are similar, these examples are similar to each other, and so on. So you get new features, new elements to describe your data, but you're not trying to predict anything in that sense. With supervised learning, we have some target values. The errors are not very visible here. And from the data, we use the feature values on the learner to try to predict the target values. But on the training set, we already have the target values. So we can check how well our system is making a prediction. This is what happens when you're trying to create a regression model to predict some continuous values, or a classification model, and so forth. We have a mixture of this. Sometimes we have part of the data labeled and part unlabeled. This happens a lot with images, for example. You can go find images on the internet. Some of them are clearly labeled about what they have, others are not. But then if you try to use them all together by mixing these different approaches, you can enrich your labeled data with unlabeled data. For example, by looking at similar examples. And then we have this reinforcement learning, which is similar to supervised learning in the sense that we have some feedback about whether things went right or wrong, but we don't have the ability to check each decision. Imagine that you're training your computer to play chess. At some point, the computer loses or wins the game, but you don't know exactly which move was the key move to win or lose, and probably there is no single move that led to that result. So we have this critic of the agent. We have some way of telling the agent things went bad, things went right, or if the autonomous car crashes or something like that. But then we need some way of assigning responsibility to different decisions and keep doing that in a way that the way of deciding at each moment improves. So this is another type of problem. We are not going to focus on this. We're going to look at unsupervised learning and supervised learning mostly. This is also important in biology. Deep neural networks and reinforcement learning has been used recently to give a huge advance in the performance of predicting protein structures. Basically, it's a mixture of supervised learning and reinforcement learning, where one network tries to predict which residues will be close together, and the other network tries to figure out how to place the torsions of the backbone of the protein so that those residues are together. But using these kinds of techniques with deep learning, this was a very important problem, still is, but now there is a much better way of predicting protein structures. So basically, we can use this to solve different kinds of problems, predicting things, organizing data, deciding, creating better policies for decisions. And then the traditional approach of machine learning to this is to use different models for different kinds of models for different problems, and use a lot of manual fine-tuning of what features to use, how to pre-process them, put them in the model, and so on. So these statistical methods for regression and classification actually predate the origin of modern artificial intelligence. We have these least squares linear regressions from the 1800s and the logistic regression from 1943 here. Basically, the idea here is that we do some feature extraction. We go to our data and select what is relevant, and then we have some linear model that gives us the output, either for a regression or for a classification. Now, in the 90s, machine learning had a big boost because if you recall from last semester, if we transform the data appropriately, we can go beyond the limitations of linear classification. And for example, with support vector machines, we have this kernel trick that transforms the data implicitly into a higher dimensional space with nonlinear transformations and does the linear classification in that space. So this now gives us a lot more power to adjust our models to the data. And also, we start in the 90s the use of multi-layered networks, for example, convolution networks. We're going to see a bit about that next week, to deal with the identification of handwritten checks and processing the postcodes for the postal services and so on. So, why is this necessary? If we have a linear classifier, we are taking a linear combination of the features, and we can basically create a straight separation between the classes. The same thing for regression, where we can use a straight line to approximate our values. And if we can do this with logistic regression, where we consider a linear combination of the inputs, so the input vector x is multiplied by the weights, the parameters that we are adjusting, and then we use this here, e raised to this in this expression, to get this output from 0 to 1, which we can interpret as the probability of belonging to class 1. So if this is close to 0, we say that this example belongs to class 0. If it's close to 1, then we say it belongs to class 1, and we can draw a threshold here at 0.5. So using this, we can do something like this, where we put the threshold here, and one class is on this side, and the other is over here. However, this line will be straight because we are using only a linear combination of the inputs into this function here. So basically, we are picking the features that we want, we apply this linear classification, and we find these weights for the classifier by minimizing this logistic loss, and this is logistic regression. So this would be a representation of the two classes, class 0, class 1, and this is the surface of the probability, of the predicted probability of being in class 1 after we adjust the model. And so we can draw a line here at 0.5 in order to separate it. But if we have data that is not linearly separable, for example here, these are actually real data points. So these are gene activities of two different genes, and the differences between tumor cells and normal cells. But if we look at a different pair of genes, then it may no longer be linearly separable. So in this case, we have one normal cell here, and we cannot draw a straight line that perfectly separates the two classes. But as we saw before, we can solve this by doing some nonlinear transformation on this data. For example, we create a third attribute with the product of the two first ones, and now our data is in 3 dimensions and spread out in a curved surface. And if we do a linear classification in 3 dimensions, we are cutting straight over that curved surface, and this is equivalent of doing a slightly curved separation here. So I don't know why the blue channel does not appear, but probably there is no no connection there. But you can see here slightly the frontier between the two. And if we increase these attributes, we can make it more and more curvy. So this is the idea that is behind, for example, support vector machines. I'm not going to detail this, but the way to train a support vector machine is to find these coefficients, these Lagrange multipliers, for all the examples in our training set, so as to maximize this expression that includes, these are the class labels, the Lagrangian multipliers, and the inner product for all pairs of examples. But the inner product of two vectors can be computed after some transformation of the vectors, sometimes by a very simple function of the inner product of the original. So this is this kernel function. And in this way, if we find the right functions, we can implicitly compute the inner product of the vectors in this expanded space, which can have lots of dimensions after complex transformations, but doing so without actually having to compute that transformation, because the kernel function gives us the inner product immediately and very simply. So this kernel trick makes support vector machines very efficient at doing this transformation for classifying. And basically, we choose which features to use. We use this trick to do the nonlinear transformation. Then this is a linear classifier implicitly in that higher dimensional space, and we can go far beyond the limitations of linear classifiers. So this is an example. This polynomial kernel, which gives us the product of the inner product of two vectors if they were subject to polynomial expansions that could increase the size of the dimension of each vector very much. But to compute the inner product after that expansion, we just use the inner product of the original, add a constant, and raise that to the power of the polynomial expansion. So just by using these parameters, we can increase the power of the expansion, and this now gives us curved lines. We can use different kinds of kernels. For example, this one would be a cubic expansion, and this allows us to go beyond the limitations of the linear classifiers. However, there is one problem here, and this is a general result for any optimization problem, so it includes machine learning, which is that if you consider the set of all mathematically possible sets of data and problems, then any optimization method will, on average, perform the same as any other. So basically, for classification, flipping a coin will perform the same as any other method if you take the average over everything that is mathematically possible. Because for any data set or problem where your method works a bit better than the others, there is a way of creating the data so that it deceives your learner and it actually performs worse than all others. However, it's important that real problems are not all mathematical possibilities. They are a very small subset limited by physics, by reality. So there are lots more better models than just flipping a coin. But the idea here is that we cannot expect to find one single model that can solve equally well all the problems that we meet in reality. So we need different models and different ways of tackling different problems. There is also the problem of overfitting. We often have to adjust the model so that it can be adequate for the data that we have. Because if it's too powerful and we have a small data set, then we'll be learning things that are too specific to that data set. I can give a recent example from my youngest daughter. She learned about Portugal and Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, and then in the test, when there was a question, what is a peninsula? And she said it's a set of two countries. So she learned one aspect of a peninsula, but that did not generalize to all the data set. And this is an example of overfitting, that if you give some particular examples and the model focuses on something that works in that data set, then it may not work outside. So we often need to fiddle with the model, select different models in order to optimize this. So, for example, if we increase too much the power of adjusting to this particular data, we can have a very good separation of these points, but then no longer be able to work well outside this data set. And we saw this last semester, that basically as you increase the power, you can lower the error on the training set, but eventually outside the training set, you start to increase the errors in your predictions. So to prevent overfitting, we need to adjust something about what we're doing, and usually this involves selecting the best model for the data that we have. So we see here that we need some way of picking different models for different problems. So basically what we have in machine learning and what we need to use. We need some kind of nonlinear transformations because otherwise we can only do linear separations, and this does not help us in most problems. And we need to be able to have different models for different problems and different data sets, because the model needs to be adequate for the data that we have and the problem that we are dealing with. We also need to find the right features in the data. Sometimes you have a database with lots of different features, but many of them are not useful. For example, if you have a database of students, and each student has a number, an identification number, if you use that in a machine learning model, it probably will only lead to overfitting or confusion, because the identification number is an arbitrary feature that doesn't tell you anything about the student. So we need some ways of finding the correct features or the correct representation of the data in order to prevent overfitting and to be able to have better performance in the results. And we also need the ability to deal with large amounts of data. This is increasingly important, especially in biology. Well, there are other fields where this also happens, in banking and fraud detection, things like that. But in biology, we have an exponentially increasing rate of data being produced because of the automation of many methods of sequencing, of the multiomics and imaging and so on. So we need models that can handle large amounts of data. In classic machine learning, we have algorithms, many algorithms that do these nonlinear transformations. We have different models, but we basically can shift from one to others, and they work in a very different way. We have to find the right features by ourselves. So if you want to use a support vector machine or logistic regression or something like that, you need to figure out what features to use. The methods of preventing overfitting depend on the algorithm that you're using, and in some cases it's very hard to use large amounts of data. For example, support vector machines are very good, but as you saw, the optimization involves multiplying, so finding the inner products for all the pairs on the training set. So you can imagine that if you have an increasingly large training set, the amount of computation you need for the support vector machine is increasing quadratically with your training set. So at some point, it becomes impossible to use it on so much data. So some algorithms are better than others for dealing with large amounts of data. But for deep learning, we have these solutions to basically all of these problems. The nonlinear transformations we have in the stacking of the neurons in the network. I'm going to talk a bit more about this on the second lecture, but by stacking layers of neurons, we are stacking nonlinear transformations, and we have those. We can build many different models just by changing the network. So the same approach allows us to adapt to any data set that we want, to different kinds of problems, by changing the architecture of the network. Finding the right features is actually something the network does, because this stacking of nonlinear transformations, they are not determined by us, for example, by choosing a kernel or a specific projection or something like that. They are learned by the network. So the network is learning different representations of the data and trying to find the best ones for the final purpose, whatever loss function we want to optimize. We have many ways of regularizing these networks, but they are always the same ways. So independent of the different networks that you have, you can put some weight decay, so try to keep the weights lower, or train the network not much, but stop training early so it doesn't overfit, things like that. And they are the same techniques regardless of the actual network that you have. And they can be used for a large amount of data, because you're just presenting the data to the network, and it doesn't matter how much data points, how much data you have, you just keep showing it to the network while it's training. Okay, so to sum up this first part, I just gave a brief overview of the course and talked a bit about the context. The idea here is that artificial intelligence includes both the field where we try to put the computer to reason explicitly like humans reason, but also this other field of machine learning where we want the computer to improve performance at some task when we do not know explicitly how to solve that task. So you can imagine it's different the problem of trying, for example, to prove that a mathematical theorem is true, because then you need all the steps of the inference, or distinguishing pictures of boats and planes, because we don't have rules to distinguish boats and planes that you can apply to the pixels of the picture. This is a more fuzzy thing, quantitative, that you need a more statistical approach. So these are the two areas that we're going to cover, or to not cover very much, but at least to touch on in this course. And I gave you these promises of deep learning that it solves all of these problems. This is something that I'm going to try to convince you on in the next lectures. So these are just some references if you want to read more about this part. And we can now take a short break.